Jesus, the very thought of you.
Hey friends, welcome to our first lesson on the very first chapter of the book of James. I'm so excited to get into this with you today. As I've gotten older, I just really appreciate a good recipe. When I was getting married at one of my bridal showers, some of the women were so kind to give me a box full of recipes. I remember Aunt Martha's tostada dip and Ida McCormick's no-bake cookies and so many other recipes. The great thing about that gift is those recipes were tried and true. You could count on them. All you had to do was follow the recipe. Other women had gone before me and made sure that they worked. What a great thing, a recipe that works. As I've developed my own tastes and styles of cooking and preferences, sometimes you get a little bored and you want to expand a little bit. And these days, I find that I don't talk to other women about recipes as much as I consult the internet, like Pinterest and other the Food Network websites and things like that. The trick with those is anybody can post anything on the internet, and it's not always very good. Sometimes the recipe works and sometimes it doesn't. And I always feel terrible about a failed recipe. I feel like I wasted food, it doesn't taste good, then I don't know what we're having for dinner. It's a gamble. So I just really appreciate a good, solid, reliable recipe. Well, in chapter 1 of James, James is going to give us 3 recipes for success. Success over trials, success over temptation, and success over tricking yourself. If you follow the recipe, you're going to have success. And it's such a great thing. See, James knows that there's a battle raging against us. He knows that the world tells us when we encounter trials, we should just avoid those because we should just do what feels good. He knows that our flesh is telling us, you should just give in. Just indulge yourself. You're worth it. You deserve it. He knows that Satan is telling us that God hates us, and that's why we're in a trial in the first place, because God would never do that, not a loving God. These lies make us immature, they make us impatient with difficulty, and they're a recipe for disaster. So James is going to give us something better, a recipe for success, some life goals that we can accomplish. And this is what we're looking for, girls. We are looking for the goal of being patient and joyful in trials. We're looking for the goal of defeating temptation before it gets to us. We're looking for being honest with ourselves. So let's look at the first part. Success over trials. We're looking at verses 2 through 12. What are trials? What is he talking about? Well, he's talking about hard things that come at us from the outside. Things like sickness or accidents or quarantine, financial disaster, even horrible tragedy, things that come from the outside. And these are things that can happen just because we're human. They can happen because of the sin that is ruling in our world right now. It's not necessarily something that you have done. This is an outside influence that he's talking about. So how can I have success over these outside influences that I cannot control? In fact, some of the versions say fall into. Like you fell in a ditch. Sometimes you don't even see it coming. This isn't something that I've gotten myself into because of bad choices. It's something that's happening from the outside to me. Okay, so how do I have success against this? Well, James tells us in verse 2, count it all joy. That's not only a command, it's also the first thing in our strategy. Count. That's what I want us to pull out of there. Count in the Greek is a financial term. We all just did this with our taxes if you filed taxes. You tallied up your payments and your credits and your deductions. You counted it all. You rendered, weighed the balance, tallied the cost. That's what he's talking about. So you're going to count these trials. You're going to render them as joy. You're going to put it in the joy column. This is an attitude he's talking about. These unexpected, hard things, he wants to tally it in the joy column. That's your strategy. Step 2 is going to tell you why. Step 2 in the strategy, and that is because you know. So this involves my mind. Counting it all joy has to do with my attitude. Knowing that the testing of my faith produces steadfastness. That's a transforming of my mind, like Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Your thoughts can put you in a different trajectory, and that's what he means here. Understand with your mind. God's intent in trials, he says here, is for our good. It's for our maturity and refinement. That's why it's happening, not because he's a big meanie. So I need to know that, and that helps me count it in the joy column. When I know it, I can count it. When I know with my head, I can change the attitude. Okay? Count it in verse 2, know it in verse 3. Verse 4 gives us the next strategy. I'm going to let steadfastness have its full effect so I can be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Not perfect in the sense of never doing anything wrong, but complete, whole. Let steadfastness. Oh, this has to do with my willingness, the surrender of my will. This is like Romans 12:1, where it is present yourself a living sacrifice. God can't do his work, his sanctifying work, without my permission. He won't fight against me like that. I have to be a willing participant. So I'm going to count, change my attitude. I'm going to know, change my mind. I'm going to change my will. And then what? Once I've done those, then I'm ready to ask God for the next step. Ask. See in verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, which clearly we all do, I'm going to ask God, who will give generously. So I ask God with a step of faith. It's a step of faith with a believing heart. This is an all-encompassing strategy. Attitude, mind, will, heart. And God will grant wisdom when I ask with a believing heart. It says he will give generously to all without reproach. He's not going to scold me for asking. He can't wait to give me the answer. I just need to be in the right place first. So those are my steps. That's how I have success over trials in my life. Excellent. Trials level the playing field, and it's practical. These steps, they work for everybody. What a great thing. So I can have success over trials. He also tells me, starting in verse 13, how I can have success over temptation. Now, wait a minute. What's the difference between temptation and trial? That sounds kind of like the same thing. Well, it's not. He's talking about something different here. Remember when I said trials were outside things happening to us, like accidents or sickness? Temptations are things happening from the inside, trying to work their way out. Like a test. It's a good thing to want to pass a test, but the right way would be to pay attention in class, to study hard, and then take the exam and prove that I know the material. I could have that desire to pass the test, but I would have the temptation to shortcut and cheat. So not pay attention in class, not study, and then cheat on the test. It's a shortcut. I've bypassed God's good plan for how to do something. That's what temptations are. That's what James is talking about here. So what's my strategy for success with temptations? What's my recipe to follow? Well, the first thing, the main idea is you need to think it through. I say this to my boys all the time when they're about to, say, punch a brother or jump off of something high or do lots of things. I say, how is that going to work out for you? I don't want to do my schoolwork today, Mom. Okay, how's that going to work out for you? I want them to think it through. And this is what James is asking us to do. Starting in verse 13, he wants us to think it through. He's going to give us 3 things to think about. The first one is God's judgment. Romans tells us that the wages of sin is death. There is a consequence for sin, and it is not good. And if you have not been covered by the blood of Christ, there's a serious judgment coming for you. even if you have been covered by the blood of Christ, there's still negative consequences to sin. And this is what James is talking about. He gives the whole lifespan, if you will, of how sin works and what it always leads to. It always does this. It starts out with this desire, like I said, to pass a test. And that desire then can bring forth a deception. Like, well, if I don't have to pay attention, who cares? It's no big deal. And I'll just copy somebody's answers and the teacher will never know. I won't get caught. I'm really good at this. And that deception turns to the disobedience, the bad choice, and then disobedience always leads to death. Look at the progression is right there in verse 14 and 15. That's not going to go unanswered. And James wants you to think about that. When you are being tempted, think about, how is this going to work out for me? There are consequences to sin. What are the consequences? Do I want those? Am I willing to deal with that? Will that bring me good? Will it bring God glory? Think about those things when you're being tempted for those shortcuts, and it will help you say no. Second thing you need to do, think about God's goodness. Look in verse 16 and 17. Every good and perfect gift is from above. What if this is actually real? Spoiler alert, it is. Now, do I really believe it's really real? If God is good and generous and reliable, like these verses say, then I don't need to look for any shortcuts because something much better and higher is coming. God's ways are higher than mine. He can do more than I can think or imagine. Why would I want to trade that for something less? Warren Wiersbe says, God's gifts are better than Satan's bargains. Why would I want a bargain when I could have a gift? A gift is better than a bargain. And God's ways are definitely better than Satan's ways. So think about that when you're tempted. The goodness of God, He is so good to me. Is this worth shortcutting and bypassing? It's not. Don't do it. So say no by thinking about God's goodness. And then the third thing James wants us to think about is God's divine nature. In verse 18, he reminds us about who God is and how the divine nature of God is living in us because we're in Christ. I have access to the power that raised Jesus from the dead. I can do this because of Christ. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. All things are possible for those who love God and who are called according to His purpose. I'm not powerless against temptation. I can think about God's judgment. I can think about His goodness. And I can access His power, that divine nature. This is doable. It's a recipe I can follow. The last thing James talks about in chapter 1 is success over tricking yourself. Have you ever tried to trick yourself before? On my wedding day, as I was walking down the aisle with my dad, it occurred to me that my makeup looked nice and so did my hair, and I was about to do something extraordinary. And the emotions all of a sudden hit me. I hadn't honestly thought about it until that moment. And instantly knew that if I really thought about it and really experienced that moment fully, I would have been a puddle on the floor. I would have been a hot mess. So I did the only thing I could think of in that split second. I started to dialogue with myself. I started to trick myself. I said some things kind of like this. This isn't a big deal. My dad's not really giving me away. It's not like I'm leaving them or anything. I mean, there's no reason to look at my grandpa in the front row who is bawling his eyes out. He just tripped on the way up here and his toe hurts. It sounds really dumb when I say it out loud now, but that's what I did. If I would have thought about it beforehand, I think I would have had a better strategy for getting myself through those moments. And that's exactly what James wants us to do. He wants us to have a strategy to get through these moments before we get there. So he doesn't want you to trick yourself. In verses 19 through 27, he's going to talk to us about how to not trick yourself, how to be honest instead. So what does James mean when he says, how do we trick ourselves? He's talking about when we hear, but we don't do. When we say, but we don't do. Forgetfulness, spiritual forgetfulness is what he's talking about. He wants us to listen to the word and then do what it says. He wants us to listen to the sermon on Sunday and then go out and live it starting that day. But a lot of us don't do this. We are like the man who looks at himself in the mirror and then walks away. I say man specifically because I don't think very many women actually do this. But what would you think of me if I had, before I came to meet with you, what if I had gone into the bathroom and checked my teeth and seen lots of breakfast in my teeth and then come and talk to you anyway and not do anything about it? You would think I was a weirdo and probably gross. James doesn't want us to be like that. So, strategy for success, first thing against tricking ourselves. He wants us in verse 19 through 21. This is a little math formula for you. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, put away filthiness and rampant wickedness, and then you will receive the implanted word. So the goal is implant the word. That's the strategy piece for how to block out the lies, implant the truth in your heart. How do I do that? Implanting the truth. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, put away filthiness and wickedness, and then the truth has a chance to grow. It reflects back to Jesus' parable of the sower. You have to prepare that soil, otherwise the seed cannot take root. So implant the word. Next, I need to examine myself, and that's where the example of the mirror comes in verses 22 through 24. James wants us to examine ourselves. When we hear something, when we read something, spend some time thinking about it, ponder it, examine yourself, just like you check your teeth or your nose or your eyes in the mirror. Examine yourself and ask, have I done that? Am I doing that? Do I need to make adjustments? How do I make this a reality in my life? Examine yourself like you would in a mirror. Step 3, if you see something or hear something that where an adjustment needs to be made, make the adjustment. Look in verse 25. The one who looks and does, who acts, he will be blessed. He's the one. So you don't get points just for listening or reading. You actually have to do what it says. It makes no difference unless you do what it says. This will result in a transformation that will make you look different than your neighbor. It will make you look different than the unbeliever, and that's what it's supposed to do. We are supposed to look different. And then James gives an example of, look, this looks different because if you're actually religious, you're going to be doing some things. Your speech will be different. Your service will be different. You'll be separated. Look at that. 3 examples. Bridle your tongue. Visit orphans and widows. Keep yourself unstained from the world. It's transformation. You've examined yourself and now you're setting yourself apart. That's what God wants for us. It'll give us success over tricking ourselves. It'll give us honesty and integrity. Years ago, my dad made a soup. He's really, in our circles anyway, well known for his delicious soup. And he found a new recipe for peanut soup. We were all thinking it was going to be some kind of Thai flavor, delicious. It was the worst soup I've ever tasted. And my dad, who has been known to take things out of the garbage and use them, threw that soup away. You don't want a bad recipe. It's no good to anyone. You have to throw it out when it's that bad. James has given us good recipes, how to have success over trials, temptation, and tricking ourselves. I pray that you will follow the recipe and you'll have success. We'll see you next time.